Daniel stood at the front of the room, looking at the students who waited with curious faces. He began with a quiet story meant to challenge their minds. Imagine, he said, you're driving a trolley at full speed. You look ahead and see 5 workers trapped on the track. The brakes fail. You try everything but nothing works. The room grew still as he continued. Then you notice a side track with only 1 worker. You can turn the wheel and save 5 people by sacrificing 1. What would you do? Murmurs floated across the room like soft echoes. Daniel pointed to the students and asked, "Raise your hand if you would turn the trolley to save the 5. Most raised their hands. And who would stay on the main track? Only a few hands appeared. Daniel smiled gently. Now tell me why. A student named Lisa stood and said, "It cannot be right to kill 5 when you can save them by taking only 1 life." Another voice added, "During disasters, we praise people who sacrifice few to save many." Daniel nodded, letting the reasoning shape the air. The class believed the numbers guided the right choice. Then Daniel introduced a twist. "This time," he said, "you're not the driver. You're standing on a bridge watching the trolley rush toward 5 workers. Next to you stands a very large man leaning over the rail. If you push him, his body will stop the trolley and save the 5. The class shifted uncomfortably. How many would push him? Daniel asked. Only a handful raised their hands. And how many would not? Nearly every student lifted a hand. Daniel nodded again. Interesting. What happened to your first rule? Saving 5 lives is better than losing 1. A student named Andrew tried to explain. This feels different, he said. Pushing a man with your hands is personal. He isn't already part of the danger. The worker on the side track was already in the path. Daniel turned to him gently. But isn't the result the same? 1 life lost, 5 saved. Andrew hesitated. Yes, but the action feels different. Turning a wheel isn't the same as pushing a person. Daniel listened without correcting him. The class could feel the tension between logic and emotion. Everyone sensed that the lines of morality were not so simple. Daniel introduced another scenario. Imagine you are a doctor in an emergency room. 6 patients arrive. 1 is severely injured and 5 have moderate injuries. If you treat the 1 severely injured patient all day, the 5 will die. If you treat the 5, the 1 will die. Many students whispered. Who would save the 5? Almost everyone raised a hand. Good, Daniel said softly. But now imagine you are a transplant surgeon. 5 patients each need a different organ. In the next room sleeps a healthy man. You could take his organs to save them. Would you? The room erupted with quiet disbelief at Daniel's new question. A student in the back whispered, "No way, you can't just take a healthy man's organs." Daniel heard the murmurs and smiled knowingly. So the rule changes again, he said. In the first medical case you saved 5 by letting 1 die. But in this case most of you refuse. A student named Karen raised her hand and said, "Because this time we're harming someone who wasn't in danger." Daniel nodded. But the numbers are still the same. 5 against 1. Why does your choice change? Daniel paused and let the silence stretch. Then he returned to storytelling. "Let me take you to a real story," he said. "Not a hypothetical one." The class leaned forward. Years ago, a small boat was stranded at sea. 4 sailors survived. One of them was a young boy named Peter. They had almost no food and no water. Days passed. Hunger weakened them. Fear surrounded them. A few students exchanged uneasy looks. Daniel continued softly. When hope felt lost, the captain wondered if someone had to die so the others could live. Peter became very sick, Daniel said. He drank seawater and grew weaker. The others believed he would not make it. One morning the captain whispered to another sailor, "If we wait, we all die." The sailor looked away, unable to respond. With a heavy heart, the captain took a knife, said a quiet prayer and ended Peter's life. Gasps filled the room. Daniel lowered his voice. They used his body to survive 4 more days until a ship rescued them. He let the pain of the story settle. When they returned home they were arrested. Daniel stepped closer to the front row. "Imagine you're the jury," he said. "Not lawyers. Not philosophers. Just human beings." He raised his hand gently. "Do you say they were guilty of murder? Or do you say they did what they had to do to survive?" A student named Marcus stood and said, It's horrible, but in that situation, people do what they must. Another student named Brit shook her head. No, she said firmly. No one has the right to choose who lives and who dies. Not even in desperation. Daniel turned toward Brit. What about consent? He asked. What if Peter had said, if someone must die, let it be me? Some students shifted, thinking deeply. A student named Kathleen said quietly, even if he agreed, it still feels wrong. He's weak, scared, dying. Can consent be real in that moment? Another student disagreed. If they all agreed to a fair lottery, maybe it would feel different. Daniel smiled slightly. Ah, he said, now you're discovering the heart of moral reasoning. Why some actions feel acceptable and others never do. Daniel looked around the room as the students processed the story. Some of you think a lottery would make their choice fair, he said. Let everyone take the same risk. Let chance decide. A student named Matt raised his hand. The real problem, he said, is that they decided the boy's life mattered less than theirs. That's the heart of every crime. Someone chooses to put their survival above another's. Daniel nodded slowly. So for you, fairness matters more than the outcome? Matt replied, yes. If all agree to a process, the result feels less like murder. Another student, Lena, leaned forward. But what if Peter lost the lottery, she asked, and then changed his mind? Would they still be allowed to kill him? Matt hesitated. Well, once you agree, you can't take it back. Lena frowned. But what if fear took over? What if he didn't really want to die? The class murmured again. Daniel stepped in gently. These tensions you're feeling, he said, are exactly what makes moral judgment so difficult. We want fairness, but we also fear forcing someone into a choice they never truly accepted. Daniel continued. Others among you believe that even with consent, the act is still wrong. A student named Claire stood. Yes, she said. Because even if Peter agreed, the whole situation pressured him. It's not real freedom when death feels inevitable. Another student added, they could have waited longer. Maybe rescue was close. Maybe killing him wasn't necessary. Daniel nodded. These are powerful objections. They come from a belief that some actions, like killing an innocent person, are simply wrong no matter the circumstances, no matter the benefits. Daniel walked slowly across the room. Now here is the bigger question, he said. Is morality based on results, or on rules? He paused, letting the words rest. Some of you believe the numbers matter most. If more people survive, the action feels right. Others believe certain actions are always wrong, even if they save many lives. A student whispered softly, so which side is correct? Daniel smiled gently. That, he said, is the journey we begin today. Not to memorize answers, but to understand why our hearts and minds judge the way they do. He shifted again. Let me show you another angle, he said. Imagine someone says, murder is murder no matter the reason. That person believes rules should guide morality, not results. A student named Devon raised his hand. But what if thousands of lives were at risk? Daniel looked at him thoughtfully. That is exactly the kind of question that challenges strict rules. If killing one person could save a city, would the rule still stand? Devon answered, I think so. Because once we allow exceptions, we can justify anything. The room fell silent at his certainty. Daniel listened and then said, some of you argue that killing is always wrong. But what about self-defense? What about war? What about emergencies? A student named Rose responded, those situations feel different. In those cases, someone is directly threatening others. Daniel nodded. True. But what about Peter? He was not threatening anyone. He was weak, helpless, and sick. Rose whispered, that's what makes it harder. Daniel agreed softly. Exactly. Morality becomes most complicated when we face harm without villains. Only desperate people and terrible choices. Daniel placed his hands on the desk. In the end, the story is not only about survival, he said. It shows the conflict between two ways of thinking. He wrote 2 words on the board. Consequences and principles. Some of you focus on consequences. Who lives and who dies. Others focus on principles. What actions are right or wrong regardless of the outcome. A student named James asked, can both be true? Daniel smiled. Perhaps. But often they pull in opposite directions, forcing us to choose which value guides our decisions. The students leaned in as Daniel went on. The philosopher Jeremy Bentham believed the right thing to do is whatever increases overall happiness. He argued that pleasure and pain guide human behavior. So the morally right action, Daniel explained, is the one that creates the greatest good for the greatest number. A student raised her hand. So Bentham would support saving 3 lives instead of 1? Daniel nodded. Yes. He believed morality should be calculated like a math equation. Add happiness, subtract suffering, and choose the result with the highest balance. Daniel erased the board slowly. But then, he said, another philosopher named Kant disagreed. The students watched him curiously. Kant believed some actions are simply wrong even if they bring good results. He believed people must never be used as tools for someone else's survival. A student named Nora whispered, so Kant would say Peter should not have been killed? Daniel nodded. Yes. For Kant, every person has dignity that cannot be traded, even for a greater number of lives. The room grew still as students felt the weight of that idea. Daniel stepped back and looked around the room. And now, he said softly, you see the heart of moral philosophy. We live every day choosing between consequences and principles, even without noticing. He continued, when we debate, reflect, and tell stories like these, we uncover the reasoning inside our choices. A student near the window asked, so what happens when our instincts disagree with our logic? Daniel smiled gently. Then, he said, you begin the real work of philosophy, understanding yourself. The class sat quietly, absorbing the message like a slow sunrise of awareness. Daniel leaned gently on the desk. Philosophy, he said, does not give us quick answers. It makes us question what we thought we already knew. A student named Helen raised her hand. But why study problems that seem impossible to solve? Daniel smiled. Because we already live our answers. Every time we justify a choice, defend a rule, or feel guilty afterward, our moral beliefs speak, even when we don't realize it. Helen nodded slowly, realizing he was right. Daniel added, philosophy takes the familiar and makes it strange so we finally see it clearly. He walked across the room, stopping beside the first row. Once something becomes strange, he continued, you cannot unsee it. That is why this work can feel uncomfortable. A student near the back asked, uncomfortable how? Daniel replied, because you begin to notice contradictions in your own thinking. You notice when your heart and mind disagree. You notice when your reasons don't match your choices. The student leaned back thinking. Daniel finished softly, self-knowledge is powerful. But it also removes the comfort of simple answers. That is both the risk and the reward. Daniel paused before continuing. And philosophy has political risks too, he said. It can challenge everything society expects from us. A student named Robert lifted his hand. How can learning philosophy make someone a worse citizen? Daniel chuckled quietly. Because once you question norms, he said, you become harder to control. You don't accept traditions blindly. You examine laws instead of obeying them automatically. Robert nodded thoughtfully. Daniel added, philosophy can make you pause, hesitate, rethink. That can feel unhelpful in a world that rewards quick decisions and simple loyalties. Another student asked, so are you saying philosophy weakens people? Daniel shook his head. Not weakens, he said. But it slows you down. It forces you to think before acting. And in societies that value speed and certainty, reflection can feel like resistance. A few students exchanged curious glances. Daniel continued, historical thinkers have often been accused of disrupting order. People fear ideas that question authority or reveal uncomfortable truths. A soft murmur filled the room as students began realizing how powerful reflection could be. Daniel leaned against the table, crossing his arms. Even long ago, he said, people warned against studying too much philosophy. He told them about an ancient thinker named Cal. Cal told a philosopher friend, stop overthinking. Go live a practical life. Earn money. Gain power. The students chuckled. Daniel smiled. Cal believed that too much reflection is dangerous. He feared it would pull people away from ambition and practical goals. A student said, but isn't thinking a good thing? Daniel nodded. Yes, but deep thinking challenges comfort. And comfort is something many people cling to. He continued, the real danger is not reflection. It's the temptation to escape difficult questions. When moral problems feel too hard, people often turn to skepticism. A student named Mia raised her hand. What do you mean by skepticism? Daniel replied, it's the belief that no answers exist. That everything is opinion. That we should give up trying to understand what is right. Mia frowned. But isn't that giving up responsibility? Daniel smiled gently. Exactly. Skepticism feels safe because it avoids commitment. But it also prevents growth. Daniel paced slowly. Many people say, if great thinkers couldn't solve these questions, why should we try? And that thought leads them to stop caring about moral clarity. A student argued, but maybe they're right. Maybe there are no real answers. Daniel paused and met his eyes. If that were true, he said softly, why do we feel guilt? Why do we admire courage? Why do we condemn cruelty? The student looked uncertain. Daniel added, our emotions reveal that we already believe some actions matter more than others. Skepticism cannot erase that. He continued, a philosopher once said skepticism is like a rest stop. You can think there for a moment, but you cannot live there. Human beings cannot stay in uncertainty forever. We search for meaning even when it hurts. A student whispered, so skepticism is running away? Daniel nodded. Running away from the responsibility to judge. If we say all choices are equal, we avoid the weight of choosing. The class grew quiet. Daniel said, philosophy challenges you to do the opposite, to face the weight honestly. Daniel turned back toward the board. Let's return to the trolley, to the doctor, to the sailors at sea. He wrote, numbers, rules, consent, fairness, human worth. These are the pieces, he said. They shape every moral decision. No matter what case we examine, these 5 ideas keep returning. A student asked, so the point isn't which answer is right? Daniel shook his head. The point is to understand why you choose the way you do, and what that reveals about the kind of person you are becoming. As the class prepared to leave, Daniel offered one final thought. Philosophy doesn't give you a final destination, he said. It gives you a compass. A student near the door asked, a compass for what? Daniel answered, a compass for navigating life, choices, relationships, politics, justice. You may change direction many times, but the compass keeps you aware. The student nodded slowly. Daniel smiled. When you learn to question deeply, you become responsible for your own reasoning. That responsibility is the beginning of wisdom, and the beginning of true moral courage. The next morning, Daniel returned to the classroom carrying a slim folder. The students watched him curiously as he placed it on the desk. Inside, he said, are real court documents from the sailor's case. The room fell silent. The judge listened to their excuses, their fears, their desperate logic. But in the end, he rejected the idea that necessity could excuse taking a life. A student named Aaron asked, so he believed rules mattered more than consequences? Daniel nodded. Yes. He believed some lines must never be crossed, no matter how painful the situation. Daniel opened the folder and continued. But here's the complicated part. While the judge insisted on strict justice, the public felt sympathy. Many believed the sailors had suffered enough and should not be punished further. A student whispered, so society disagreed with the judge? Daniel replied, deeply. Another student asked, why would people support them after what they did? Daniel smiled sadly. Because humans understand desperation. They imagine themselves starving at sea. They picture their own families waiting at home. The students listened quietly as Daniel added, emotion and principle often collide. A student named Jonah leaned forward. So what happened to the sailors? Daniel closed the folder gently. They were found guilty, but their sentence was reduced to only a few months. Some students gasped softly. Was that fair? One asked. Daniel shrugged thoughtfully. It depends on which moral lens you use. If you believe consequences matter most, perhaps the shorter sentence feels right. If you believe in strict rules, maybe even that feels too light. Jonah whispered, so justice depends on the story we choose to tell ourselves. Daniel nodded at Jonah's insight. Exactly. Justice is not just about laws. It's about the stories we accept as true. A student raised her hand. But what if stories mislead us? Daniel answered, then we must examine them carefully. Philosophy teaches us to look beneath emotions, assumptions, and instinct. She nodded slowly. So philosophy helps us separate what feels right from what is right. Daniel smiled. Sometimes. But often it reveals that the two are not as far apart as we think. The class fell into thoughtful silence. Then Daniel wrote on the board again. Who deserves to be sacrificed? Who deserves protection? Who decides? Students stared at the questions. These are the hardest questions in moral life, Daniel said. We wrestle with them during war, healthcare decisions, public policy, and even personal relationships. A student named Lily spoke softly. No one wants to be the one chosen to die. Daniel nodded. Exactly. And because none of us want that, the rules we create must treat everyone with dignity, even the weakest among us. Daniel took a deep breath. We've discussed trolleys, doctors, sailors, judges, and philosophers. But the real question is this. What do these stories reveal about you? A student whispered. About us. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Each choice you made in these stories, turning the wheel, pushing the man, taking the organs, shows your instincts about fairness, harm, and responsibility. Another student asked, so philosophy is really self-examination? Daniel replied, exactly. You discover who you are long before you decide who you want to become. He continued, that's why philosophers warn that self-knowledge can be unsettling. Once you recognize the reasons behind your choices, you cannot unsee them. You begin noticing hypocrisy in yourself and others. You notice when principles conflict with personal comfort. A student said softly, it sounds exhausting. Daniel laughed gently. At times, yes. But it is also freeing. When you understand your own reasoning, the world becomes clearer. You are no longer pushed around by feelings you cannot explain. Daniel placed the chalk down. And this clarity influences everything: how you vote, how you lead, how you treat others, how you respond to crisis. A student asked, so philosophy shapes character? Daniel nodded. Deeply. It doesn't give you a list of rules. It gives you the courage to question, evaluate, and choose with purpose. The student whispered, and without that courage? Daniel answered softly, you might follow ideas you never examined, or defend actions you never understood. The room grew still as if the very air leaned in to listen. Daniel folded his hands. Remember this, he said. When you face moral conflict, there may not be a perfect answer. But there will always be a meaningful question. And your willingness to confront it honestly is what defines your integrity. A student near the window asked, so morality is less about being right and more about trying to be responsible? Daniel smiled warmly. Beautifully said. Yes. As the students gathered their things, Daniel offered one final message. Philosophy is not a path to certainty, he said. It is a path to understanding. They paused in the doorway as he added, let your thinking stay restless. Let your questions stay alive. And when life places you at a crossroads, whether real or in your heart, remember that wisdom begins the moment you ask, why does this feel right or wrong to me? The students left the room quietly, each carrying a story, a question, and a small spark of courage to think more deeply about the world.